Good morning, everybody. This is when we really start to separate the sheep from the goats. First thing on the second day, and then by first thing on the third day, that's when they hand out the gold medals, right? So in my presentation today, I want to talk about the theory of the firm, production theory. I'm actually going to talk about several perspectives within economics on the theory of the firm, including the Austrian perspective, but I'm going to talk about some of the other perspectives and then compare them and have a few words of assessment or evaluation of those views. There has been a claim made by some writers in the Austrian tradition that the theory of the firm is a missing chapter in Austrian economics. And while that may be literally true in the sense that I can't find a chapter titled The Theory of the Firm in Human Action or in Man, Economy, and State, I think it's not true thematically because the theory of the firm runs through much, if not all, of the Austrian economics literature. And I'm going to kind of touch on a few places where I see elements of the theory of the firm. So I think there is a theory of the firm. I think it's a well-developed, integrated, and quite insightful theory of the firm in Austrian economics, but it's just not all collected together in one place, although there have been some more recent contributions in the Austrian tradition that are attempting to bring some of these ideas together. So firms in the price system, Hayek described the price system as this means of social adaptation to change, this means of transforming subjective knowledge into objective knowledge, but the price system, as I said yesterday in Hayek in 1945, is a bit of a black box. There really isn't an exposition of the process through which this transformation takes place. And this, of course, begs the question, well, what role do firms play in this process? And is there, as some have claimed, a missing chapter in Austrian economics on the theory of the firm? By way of motivation, there are a number of reasons that we might think that we need an economic theory of the firm. First, firms exist. In the real world, there are these things called firms, and if we are realists as theorists, and Austrians, I believe, are realists in many respects, firms exist and persist as social institutions. So what does the human action axiom tell us about why people bother to do this? Why do people bother to form firms? It's not easy to form a firm. It's not easy to keep one together. So it involves the expenditure of effort and time and money and other things. So why do people bother to do this? What's the role of the function of firms in price formation and price change? And here is one area where the Austrian perspective really diverges quite sharply from other perspectives within economics in terms of the role or function of firms in price formation and price change. What's the nature of this type of institution? I'm going to talk a little bit about Coase's theory of the firm in a few minutes, and Coase's perspective on the firm is that the firm is an environment which defies the price system. It's an environment in which the price system is suspended in some respects. What's the connection between the theory of capital and the theory of the firm? The theory of the firm helps us understand the nature of profit, what function it serves, and answers the question, is it a legitimate form of income? What's the nature of the relationship between entrepreneurs and providers of capital? And I'll talk a little bit about a bit of a tension, a bit of a debate, a controversy within Austrian economics as to which of those two players, the provider of capital or the entrepreneur, is the more important agent in the firm. And understanding the nature of competition. We need a theory of the firm to understand the nature of competition, particularly as it applies to competition regulation and antitrust. And Austrians have quite a different view on that than other economists. Okay. More specific Austrian questions on the theory of the firm. How is entrepreneurship involved in the formation and ongoing existence of firms? Does entrepreneurship exist within firms, or is that something which is external to firms? ABCT, I normally loathe acronyms. I ask my students to abide by the NAR, which is the no acronym rule. One of my students just walked in. He's completely familiar with the NAR. The Austrian business cycle theory is based on the idea that there are clusters of entrepreneurial errors in firms. So we need a theory of the firm to understand how is it so many firms can get so stupid all at the same time for business cycles to happen. Industry structure. In most industries, firms of different sizes and shapes exist at points in time. How can these different firms all coexist in the same industry at the same time? Over time, firms are formed, they grow, they change, they dissolve. some cease to exist. Why is that? I think there are implications for business management and policy. And then perhaps a more theoretical question, why is planning a good thing in a complex firm, but it's a bad thing for a whole economy, for a whole society? We think it's good for firms to be planning. It's not good for societies to be planning. So I think even the economic calculation debate in planning theory relies to some extent on the theory of the firm. There are a number of distinctive elements in what I've described as the thematic treatment of the theory of the firm in Austrian economics. I've posed them as sort of either-ors because the Austrian view tends to be distinguished from what I'll call the Walrasian view, which others this week have called the mainstream view or the neoclassical view. Remember yesterday I said of all the groups within economics, Austrians have the strongest claim historically to being called neoclassical. So I don't like to talk about the Austrians versus the neoclassicals. That's kind of like a war with ourselves. So the distinction between uncertainty and risk, or as Richard Langlois says, structural uncertainty and parametric uncertainty, that's a central distinction. In general economics, risk and uncertainty are often used as synonyms. And in the Austrian tradition, we maintain that they are distinct phenomena. Equilibrium as an existing state versus an ideal type. We tend to be on the ideal type side. That equilibrium is, we have a tendency to move toward equilibrium, but we never, ever, ever really get there. Competition as an outcome versus competition as a process. The process orientation is the Austrian perspective on the firm. The outcome is the Walrasian perspective. Knowledge of the particulars of time and place versus scientific knowledge. I talked about that yesterday. Entrepreneurship, which in this context I'm going to describe as discovery in a context of uncertainty, versus management, which is optimizing, including optimal search. Implementation is an important distinction. Entrepreneurial action versus the provision of capital. Allocation, economics is a study of the allocation of scarce means among competing ends, or economics and the understanding of the process of the mobilization of knowledge, which is the Hayekian perspective. And then objective versus subjective opportunity costs. And Walter talked about this a little bit yesterday about how economists define opportunity cost in Chapter 1, and then in Chapter 4 they draw these cost curves as though they know where everything is quantitatively. And the Austrian theory of the firm tends to reject that view. Okay, I'm not going to unpack all of those distinctions, but I thought it might be useful to talk about a couple of them anyway, just to give you a sense of what maybe some of the more important ones are. Israel Kirzner describes uncertainty as a situation where the decision maker is ignorant of the extent of his own ignorance. Donald Rumsfeld described this as the category of unknown unknowns, for those of you that follow U.S. politics. He is subject to genuine surprise when he is making a choice without knowing what he is selecting or what he is giving up. Okay, so the idea of uncertainty involves we don't know what we don't know. Perhaps psychologically, the resolution of uncertainty, when the uncertainty is resolved, when we get to the point of knowing what we didn't know, our responses might be surprise. Gee, I never would have expected that. It could be genuine learning. Well, I'll look out for that next time. I didn't realize that that could even happen. Discovery and adaptation. So those are the kinds of reactions that we have when we resolve uncertainty. The resolution of risk does not involve surprise. Risk would be characterized as something like flipping a coin. If I flip a coin and it comes up heads, I ought not to be surprised, right? Because I knew it either had to be heads or tails. When I flip a coin and it comes up tails, I haven't learned anything, okay? So there isn't any surprise, there isn't any learning, there isn't any discovery. Oh, look, I got heads. Okay, so alternative conceptualizations of the firm. This is a bit of a survey piece. I want to go through a number of the leading conceptualizations of the firm and compare and contrast a little bit, but mostly argue that the alternative conceptualizations of the firm within economics are deficient in important respects. Adam Smith started off The Wealth of Nations with this discussion of the pin factory and the specialization in the division of labor, so that's his characterization of the firm. I'm not going to talk too much about that today, but historically That was, in some respects, where the story started. The neoclassical tradition established by Walras and Jevons, and those are the other two names in the 1871 miracle that happened in neoclassical economics, view the firm as an optimizing organization in the context of equilibrium. Marginal this equals marginal that, maximize profits, minimize costs, etc. Coase and Williamson more recently have developed something called transaction cost theory, and really that started with a work that Coase published in 1937. It was half of the work that he was awarded, for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize. His 1937 paper was based on a term paper that he wrote when he was a third-year undergraduate student, and so I like to ask my fourth-year students which of their papers that they wrote in third year will be half responsible for them getting the Nobel Prize when they're 80. And nobody's given me anything just yet on that. Edith Penrose, who is read widely in business schools, has developed something called the resource-based theory of the firm, which I'm going to talk about briefly. And then contributions by a number of Austrian economists. Menger, Mises, Hayek, Kerzner, Sauté, Rothbard have developed what I call an entrepreneurial capitalistic theory of the firm. And Charles Koch, in a recent book, The Science of Success, and Alexander Havard in another book called Virtuous Leadership, draw on some of these ideas. Koch in particular recognizes and acknowledges his intellectual debt to Mises and Hayek in his 2007 book, The Science of Success. Okay, so I'm going to jump over Smith and go right into the Walrasian, Jevonsian economics. As I said, the firm in this perspective is an optimizing organization, and there are a number of contributions to the literature here going back to the 1930s. Sune Carlson, the Swedish economist, The Pure Theory of Production. Paul Samuelson's PhD dissertation, which became later the Foundations of Economic Analysis. Charles Ferguson's Neoclassical Theory of Production, and then Fuss and McFadden's Production Economics book in the 1970s, representing increasingly levels of mathematization of these ideas, although it's been pretty mathematical really right from the beginning. The idea in all of this literature is that firms are optimizers. They either maximize profits subject to, so the firm is set up or characterized as a maximization organization, maximize profits subject to a production function, or minimize costs subject to a production function. And there are, in fact, empirical tests of validation of this approach, and they were pioneered really by Samuelson in his 1947 book, based on what are called mathematically the second-order conditions, the sufficient conditions for an optimum. And depending on whether economists are dealing with the profit maximization problem or the cost minimization problem, they're somewhat different, but there are basically four statistical hypotheses to test about the relationships that come out of the maximization problem. And the relationships in the profit case are the profit function, the product supply function, the factor demand or input demand functions. In cost, it's the cost function and the supply function, and what are called the conditional factor demand functions. This is probably more technical than we need to get into today. But the point is that all of these are they're hypotheses subject to econometric test. And unfortunately, economists have been loath to subject this theory to serious econometric tests for the most part. One of my graduate students and I, Lena Kavanda, in the early 90s, collected 71 studies that used this approach in agricultural economics. And of the 71 studies, we found one study that in fact tested all four hypotheses. So all the other studies either assumed that the hypotheses were true and then just went ahead and did some modeling and some analysis, or they didn't even talk about these as being hypotheses, or they tested some of the hypotheses. But we only found one study that A, tested all the four hypotheses, and B, failed to reject the four hypotheses. And that was a study of tea plantations in Sri Lanka. So our conclusion was that if you are talking about tea plantations in Sri Lanka, this is a rather good theory. But if you're talking about virtually anything else, it's an untested theory. L.A. Applebaum previously had done a similar study outside of agricultural economics, in general economics, looking at manufacturing firms, and he found essentially the same pattern, that economists using this model had failed to follow through on the testing, and when they had tested it, they tended to reject the hypotheses. So the track record of this theory empirically is abysmal, both in application and in execution, but it's also abysmal from simply a logical impossibility point of view. Optimization has been treated really on two dimensions. One is what's the optimal level of output, and B, what's the optimal quantity of certain inputs, particularly land, labor, capital, and so forth. But of course, running a business is more than just choosing the amount of output and choosing the quantities of inputs, right? And if you think about it, if you were going to optimize on every dimension running a business, you'd have to optimize on the thickness of the pavement in the parking lot, optimize on the number of toilets in the office, optimize on the number of phone lines and the number of desks, optimize on the size of the sign that you have out on the street. There's no end to the dimensions of optimization. So I would argue that, in fact, it's beyond human cognitive capability to genuinely be full optimizers when we think about real businesses. Okay, the transaction cost theory of the firm was developed largely by Coase, this essay in 1937, which he wrote when he was an undergraduate. And it's based on the idea of transaction costs. He defines transaction costs as the value of the resources used up in making or attempting to make a market exchange. Okay? This is very closely related to Menger's concept of marketability of commodities that some of us talked about yesterday. So a transaction cost is the value of resources. It costs something to make a market exchange. It doesn't just happen. It takes effort. So what do we have to do? Well, first, we incur search costs. If I've got eggs, and I want to find someone who might want eggs and has shoes, and I want shoes, I have to find somebody that has shoes and is interested in eggs. Okay? So that's going to cost, I'm going to have to sacrifice time and effort to do that. Second element of transaction costs are negotiation costs. Once I find someone with shoes and they find me with eggs, then we have to decide, well, exactly how many eggs is a pair of shoes worth, etc. And that may take time. We may or may not come to an agreement. And then the final element is what Coase originally called verification or concluding costs. Later on he changed the word, and I think he muddied the waters when he did. But verification and including costs involve me making sure that when I walk away from the exchange, I actually had a pair of shoes, and it's the pair of shoes I thought I was bargaining to get, and the other party has the eggs, and that the eggs are not spoiled. Okay? So making sure that the terms of the transaction were carried out. So the transaction cost theory of the firm says, well, if a firm hired new employees every day, so if you got hired in the morning and then fired at night, and then the next morning got rehired, then the firm might be able to avoid some costs. Let's say they only needed you for 4 days. So they hired you for 4 days, fired you on the 5th day, and then the following Monday hired you back again. They might gain some advantage with costs. On the other hand, they would incur higher transaction costs because next Monday they'd have to go out and maybe you've moved on. Maybe you've got some other job. So the firm might hire people on an ongoing basis and pay them, in a sense, more than they're worth on the market at any given day or any given moment, but avoid transaction costs. And so Coase's theory of the firm is that firms are institutions that are created to avoid transaction costs, and they are ongoing relationships among factors of production, and in particular, ongoing relationships with labor. So the firm consists of this hierarchical cooperative relationship among owners of goods of higher order, factors of production, including labor, under the direction of a manager. Coase characterizes the firm as a context within which the market process is suspended. And Coase, quoting a statement from Robertson much earlier, said that firms are like lumps of butter floating in a pail of buttermilk. Now, buttermilk's not a commonly consumed beverage. My father was a huge fan of buttermilk, so I became familiar with it, although I detested it for personal consumption myself. But I see there's some friendly nods in the audience. Dad used to love it. But basically, the milk part, according to this metaphor, is the price system, and the lumps of butter floating in the milk, those are the firms, and the butter is different. It's a different consistency. Sometimes this is referred to a nexus of contracts perspective, or sometimes it's described as the team theory of the firm. At one level, the transaction cost theory of the firm rejects the idea that the firm is an optimizing organization, but optimization kind of creeps in the back door in some respects because there is a theory developed has to do with the boundaries of the firm, the decision as to whether or not a particular activity in a firm should be conducted within the business or whether it should be contracted out, outsourced. And that there's an optimization condition based on scale economies on the one hand internally versus transaction costs externally. So there still is a bit of optimization theory implicit in this view. Okay? So there are benefits to organizing a firm, avoiding transaction costs, but in this theory there are also disadvantages of organizing a firm. Once people get in the door, then they might engage in opportunistic behavior among the owners of factors of production. There might be shirking. I might agree to start work at 9 o'clock, but I really don't start till 9:15, and I take a long coffee break, and I take stationery and take it home for my own purposes, and that sort of thing. Or there may be what are called hold-up problems. That is where one branch of the firm might say, if you don't give us a raise, we're not going to do what we're supposed to do, and kind of extort higher payments out of other parts of the firm. And there may be errors of management. That is, in this suspension of the price system, the managers might say, okay, I want you to sweep the floors all day today, but really you should have been making widgets, because widgets are what we sell, clean floors are not what we sell. So that comes about from the suspension of the price system. And in fact, when I read this literature, I always come away with the impression like it's some sort of miracle that firms exist, because on the one hand there's this benefit of reducing transaction costs, but on the other hand there are all these headaches and nightmares and problems associated with running a firm, and it's amazing that a firm would ever last for more than about an hour. There is no theory of entrepreneurial discovery, and there really isn't a theory of capital allocation. In this theory, capital kind of exists, and the manager is directing all factors of production. Capital has no special role, and there really isn't any acknowledgement of the role of entrepreneurial discovery. Edith Penrose's work was, I think, unjustly ignored for a long, long time. It's become more influential recently, particularly in business schools. And it's sometimes referred to as the capabilities theory of the firm. The firm, under her treatment, consists of a collection of resources or capabilities. And resources earn rents, and some economists have been critical of Penrose, saying, well, what do you actually mean by rents? Because rents have at least two meanings in economics. And it seems to me that Penrose has this idea in mind that by cooperating together, by staying together as an organization, owners of factors of production can do better than they could if they were out on their own. And it's that differential that she has in mind when she says rents. And so the firm is an organization that facilitates the maintenance of these rents somehow. But her theory of entrepreneurship views the entrepreneur as an optimal searcher or resource allocator, but not really an opportunity discoverer. So there isn't any entrepreneurial alertness, discovery, or learning function that I can discern in this theory. The entrepreneur really is a manager in the Austrian lexicon. And so the resource-based theory really lacks a well-developed theory of the entrepreneur, and so it doesn't really offer, I find, a very satisfying explanation of how firms develop and maintain these capabilities that sustain these streams of rents. Okay, so what are some of the elements of what I'll call the Austrian theory, which doesn't exist, as I said earlier, in any singular chapter, but runs throughout? Well, Menger's theory of property and production, his theory of goods of higher and lower order, I think is an important element of the theory. Mises and Kerzner's theories of entrepreneurial discovery and property rights are important elements of the Austrian theory. Fetter's and Kerzner's theories of time preference, interest, and capital are important components of the Austrian theory of the firm. Hayek's theory of knowledge and of entrepreneurial action in a context of disequilibrium. The subjectivity of opportunity costs and therefore profits is foundational. The distinction between a planned order and a spontaneous order, or as Menger referred to a spontaneous order and organic order. And then the theory of organization, Mises' theory of bureaucracy being a leading example of that. Okay, so what do we mean by entrepreneurship? And Shawn lectured on this a little bit yesterday, so I'm not going to go into any detail on that. In one sense, entrepreneurial alertness is embedded in all human action from the Austrian point of view. The entrepreneurial function is a type of arbitrage, but sometimes it's misunderstood in a sense, because normally we think of arbitrage as buying low and selling high, whether that's across space or it's across time. There's a special quality to the arbitrage function of the entrepreneur. And because the entrepreneur is imagining future prices that are too high relative to current and anticipated prices of factors of production. So it's this role of vision, this role of imagination, this role of perception, which is a little bit different than sort of our common run-of-the-mill arbitrage condition. Okay? Or it's imagining a future price for a good that doesn't currently exist. Normally we don't think of arbitrage in those terms. I'm imagining a good that doesn't exist yet, and I'm imagining a price that good will fetch should it come into existence at some point in the future. So I think it's a more complex and richer idea of arbitrage. Entrepreneurial perceptions are tested experientially or experimentally. How do we know if the entrepreneurial perception is right? I was sailing a few years ago with a policeman from Britain, and he used an expression that I found quite disturbing at first, but I came to appreciate it a little bit later. When you're sailing, there are a lot of things that you just, it's kind of trial and error, some things. And he used the expression, suck it and see, which if you've been to Britain, maybe you've heard that. I'd never heard that expression, suck it and see, which in Canadian would be trial and error. We don't know for sure if this is going to work or not, but we'll try and we'll see. Maybe he's the only one in Britain that uses that expression, but that's how entrepreneurial perceptions are tested. Entrepreneurial error is possible. In fact, it's commonplace, both in the form of missed opportunity. I didn't see an opportunity that was really there. And secondly, I perceived an opportunity that really wasn't there. And so that's part of the process of discovery. The Austrian perspective maintains that entrepreneurship is not a resource, it's not a productive factor, and some Austrians maintain that it can't be bought or sold, that it is an inalienable attribute. And there actually is a bit of a controversy, I think, in the Austrian literature on the question of whether entrepreneurship can be bought or sold. And Kerzner maintains that entrepreneurial alertness has no opportunity cost, simply because it's a discovery, and you didn't know what you didn't know before you discovered it. And so you couldn't have sacrificed anything in order to get lucky in some respects. But at its core, entrepreneurial action is an expression of human creativity, the human will, initiative, vision, imagination, and even leadership. And all of these are elements, particularly in Koch's and Havard's theory of leadership. Just to give you a sense of the problematic status of entrepreneurship in the economic theory of the firm generally, once we get outside the Austrian tradition, here's a really useful quotation from Jonathan Hughes. The problem of entrepreneurship for economists, and he's saying Walrasian economists, he doesn't know that he's talking about Walrasian, Jevonsian economists, but we do. So the problem of entrepreneurship for economists is that the best developed and best understood part of the theory, neoclassical economics, by which he means Walrasian, Jevonsian neoclassical economics, is really mathematics. Business firms in that system are merely formulas, production functions. There are no people, no institutions. It's a timeless paradigm of resources shifting back and forth according to changes in relative prices and costs. This has meant that entrepreneurship, the most forceful, dramatic, and obvious phenomenon of economic life, has perforce been ignored by theoretical economists in their story of how economic events happen. William Baumol, who again is in the Walrasian, Jevonsian tradition, has written about entrepreneurship And his confession is that the entrepreneur is at once one of the most intriguing and the most elusive characters that constitutes the subject of economic analysis. So this distinction, this emphasis on the importance of entrepreneurial discovery and entrepreneurship in the Austrian tradition really sets it apart from the other ways of thinking about the theory of the firm in economics. And people in those other traditions are at least aware that there's a gap. At least aware that in their theoretical framework, entrepreneurship is really difficult to incorporate. Now, there are at least three treatments of entrepreneurial alertness in the Austrian tradition. And entrepreneurial alertness in human action really is an element of all human action. Israel Kirzner has spent quite a bit of time exploring what he calls the pure entrepreneur. And the pure entrepreneur, I think, is an ideal type. It emphasizes this entrepreneurial perception, but Kirzner characterizes the pure entrepreneur as owning no resources. And if we take that literally, that means that the pure entrepreneur has to be a disembodied spirit. Because if you don't own resources, you don't own your own body, you don't own your own labor, you don't own anything. So it's an ideal type. I'm not saying that as a criticism, I'm saying that as a clarification. I think his analysis of the pure entrepreneur is extremely important and insightful, but it's important to appreciate it for what it is. Mises talks about the entrepreneur promoter, and the entrepreneur promoter, I think, is central to our understanding as Austrians of the theory of the firm. The idea of the entrepreneur promoter is this is the individual with imagination, with entrepreneurial perceptions, with an idea of the future price of a future product that doesn't yet exist, but doesn't own sufficient property at the present time to realize that imagination, to make that product come. And so has to not only have the imagination, but also has to be a promoter, has to recruit owners of other factors of production, including capital. Then Rothbard talks about the entrepreneur capitalist. And the entrepreneur capitalist has both the imagination and the means of realization. Okay? And then hires the other factors of production. Particularly, the means of realization owns capital, sufficient capital, to go out and hire the factors of production to realize the entrepreneurial vision. So there are these at least three perspectives on the nature of entrepreneurial alertness, and I'm going to argue that Mises' perception is central to our understanding, particularly of the origin or the genesis of firms. Okay? So the entrepreneur promoter imagines a future market opportunity which, given current factor prices and plans and technologies to transform goods of higher order into goods of lower order, appears attractive. But the entrepreneur does not own sufficient property, especially enough financial capital to realize this idea. So he or she needs to persuade someone with capital to foot the bill. If entrepreneurial perception is not alienable, the entrepreneur can't sell the idea to the capitalist, so it has to be a joint venture. And this emphasizes the importance of trust, shared perspectives, business conceptualization, and I think this leads us into a theory of leadership and a theory of shared vision. They have to get on the same page sufficiently to realize the view. Okay. Kirzner, in his entrepreneurial theory of production, argues that there are two views on what production is. There's an equilibrium and a disequilibrium perspective, the equilibrium perspective being more in the Walrasian tradition. And in that, production is the transformation of goods of higher order into goods of lower order, following known processes and practices, and it gives the appearance of being automatic. You pour the inputs in one end of the black box and the outputs come out the other end of the black box. So production could come to be seen as the automatic outgrowth of the factors of production employed, like fruit growing on an untended tree. Okay? And the value of the market inflow is equal to the value of the market outflow, and each factor earns the value of its marginal product, and so there are zero economic profits. And so that's the Walrasian perspective. But from a disequilibrium perspective, and this is the perspective in the Austrian view, the entrepreneur perceives this unexploited opportunity. The capitalist The owner of capital furnishes the means, hires the services of the factors of production, which are paid generally fixed immediate remuneration, and then the entrepreneur owns the output jointly with the capitalist. Okay? Here, production is an expression of human creativity, of initiative. Output comes into existence because a human being has exercised his or her will in a particular fashion. Owners of factors of production consented to the use for fixed compensation. That's their deserved, that's their fair compensation. And the output of production is the property of the entrepreneur and the capitalist. And the entrepreneur's rights to this output rest on the vision of an initiative, which at the time when he owned no productive resources, he undertook to marshal them for his own purposes. Frederick Sauté wrote a book about 15 years ago now, The Entrepreneurial Theory of the Firm, which is an excellent book if you want to explore some of these things in more detail. In some respects, he draws on the insights of the transaction cost and resource-based theories. He certainly discusses those, but observes that they do retain these vestigial estimates, elements of optimization, which he, like me, think are questionable. He argues that firms are integral components of the Hayeckian price system. They're not lumps of butter floating in a pail of buttermilk, and that firms play a central role in solving the problem of social coordination in the face of Hayek's knowledge problem. Okay? He does say that firms are a planned order. The firm is a set of time contracts among input owners under the guidance of an entrepreneur promoter, and the entrepreneur hires the input owners financed by capitalists. The revision of the production plan is the function of the entrepreneur, and the execution of the revised production plan is the function of the manager. So he has this separation of entrepreneurship from management. And firms are vehicles, they're means, they're institutional settings that facilitate cooperation between entrepreneurial perceptions and provision of capital. But there are also contexts which make innovation possible so that entrepreneurship occurs within the firm on an ongoing basis, and that's what sustains its existence. More recently, Charles Koch, who is one of the Koch brothers of Koch Industries, published a book called The Science of Success, and it's based on a model that he apparently has copyrighted called market-based management, which is an application of the Austrian theory of the firm. He describes it as a holistic approach to management that integrates theory and practice and prepares organizations to deal successfully with the challenges of growth and change. And he acknowledges that much of his approach to managing Koch Industries he gleaned from reading Mises and Hayek. He views the firm as an integrated, like Sauté, he views the firm as an integrated element of the price system. It's a vehicle for experimentation on entrepreneurial perceptions. And one of the principles that's involved in market-based management is an expectation of and a tolerance for failure. Not an intention to fail, but a realization that if we're going to conduct experiments within an organization, not everything's going to work. And that we have to come to expect and be able to tolerate and deal with failure for the experiments that don't work. The conceptual foundations of market-based management are the subjective theory of value, and these are listed in his book: the subjective theory of value, the principle of comparative advantage, the importance of spontaneous order, marginal costs and benefits, knowledge of the particulars of time and place, combined with what he calls principled leadership and a low rate of time preference. Okay? So that to successfully manage a firm as an ongoing organization, you have to be prepared to view future benefits at a lower discount rate than perhaps other people do. You have to be in it for the long run. Okay, so what are some of the implications of this theory, or of the Austrian theory? Well, one is that price proposing and product introduction are important and central functions of firms. Firms are price creators. They're an integral part of the price system. They propose and they adjust prices as well as production plans, and this is a process of discovery. Okay. Price proposing and product differentiation are viewed with suspicion, for the most part, in the rest of economics outside the Austrian tradition. And price proposing and product differentiation are often subject to punitive measures in antitrust regulation. The Austrian theory of the firm says, no, these are good things. It's good things that somebody has to propose prices. Now, consumers may accept or reject those prices, but somebody has to propose the prices. Okay. And then product differentiation is one of the ways that firms experiment to refine their product offerings to consumers. Okay? From the vantage point of the entrepreneurial perspective of the firm, both price proposing and product differentiation would appear to be normal, even necessary action, and certainly firms are not like lumps of butter in a pail of buttermilk. Second point, and I don't know whether this is an implication or question, but there is a tension, as I mentioned earlier, a controversy in the Austrian economics literature about who is more important, the entrepreneur or the capitalist. And Israel Kirzner argues that it's the entrepreneur, that what's really in short supply is ideas, and if you have good ideas, you can find somebody with capital to finance your business venture. Rothbard, on the other hand, says ideas are a dime a dozen. We got all kinds of ideas lying on the table, and the only thing, and what prevents them from being realized is insufficient capital. So he says that the capital is more important. I think this is sort of a taste great, less filling debate. Those of you that remember that from the 80s about light beer. There were these commercials where football players in bars would argue whether this new brand of light beer tasted great or whether it was less filling, and the lesson is, of course, they're both right. But I think a more holistic perspective is that the firm is a necessary institutional context to facilitate cooperation between these two types of individuals, and it's not important who is more important. So is there a missing chapter in Austrian economics and the theory of the firm? Well, literally, I suppose there is. I can't point you to that chapter and say read pages 100 to 150. But thematically, I think the theory of the firm runs throughout Austrian economics, and it provides us with a distinctive perspective on the role of firms in human society, the role of firms and businesses in the price system, and it integrates the theory of capital, the theory of entrepreneurial alertness, and the theory of organization. And that's it. I think Shawn yesterday talked about production operating through time, and the cooperation between the entrepreneur and the capitalist needs to take place through time, and so at least they need to be in it together for some period of time. The contractual terms for other contributors to the production process can be varied. And there may be a transaction cost economizing element that it might make sense to hire you at $500 a week on an ongoing basis rather than try to rehire you every day. Or maybe it's better to hire casual labor on a daily basis. But at least the entrepreneur, promoter, and the capitalist, and there may be other factors of production, such as land and buildings, that you don't want to be looking for every day. So I'm not saying that the transaction cost theory is completely irrelevant with respect to the Austrian theory, because prior to transaction cost theory, we did have Menger's theory of marketability of commodities. But where the transaction cost theory, I think, is deficient is in this separation of the firm from the price system, which I think they overstate that separation. And there was another Oh, and then this idea that if you read this literature, it's just a miracle that firms exist because there's so many problems in firms and the only thing you're gaining is reduced transaction costs. Transaction costs look pretty good compared to shirking problems and hold-up problems and all these other types of internal problems that theory recognizes in the firm.
That's really true. I mean, we would expect to see in the market around us a lot of firms composed of just entrepreneur and capitalist, and that doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, people tend to organize a lot more in at least small businesses. They're going to have 3 or 4 employees to even be considered a small business. So is there any Austrian explanation for that to be more pervasive than the kind of just entrepreneur capitalist plus the market plus the price system environment?
Well, I think the theory of comparative advantage says that entrepreneurs are good at doing one thing, capitalists are doing one thing, labor is good at doing and so forth, and that it is the cooperation among all these factors of production on an ongoing basis that's necessary. And this institutional context which enables owners of the factors of production to have consistent expectations of one another. And so that's why I think the Austrian theory rests on some of these things that economists don't sometimes talk about so much, which is trust and vision and shared conceptualization of the business model and the brand, those types of things, which I think are that's part of the glue that holds this cooperative venture together.
I'm actually going to cut it off there so that everybody has time to get a coffee and stay awake while I throw it on.
Self-interest rears its ugly head.
Yesterday we logged out by mistake or something like that.
Oh, did I?
Yeah, so just make sure we don't.
I didn't know anything. I just pulled my plug.
Oh, okay, no, I mean yesterday afternoon. So we just want to figure it out. Oh, wait a second. Here we go. How do I get to the desktop itself?
Click.
Oh, yeah. Oh, wait. What's that? Oh, did somebody put that up there? Oh, okay.
What do you want?
Oh, no, I just wanted to see the...
The reason why I'm raising it is because the concept of the firm, to me, is very limited.
Oh.
That's what you want.
No, but I just want to see the big screen, because I want to. We want to try bringing up a. David, you want to bring your US? You got your presentation?
The big firms, back in the past, it seems to be a lot of people
No, because I thought there was a way to. Make it big.
On this screen itself?
Yeah, to make the screen big, but I don't know if there is. Yeah, don't worry about it. It's fine. I mean, you can barely see it, so.
Well, yeah, and so Laurier increased its population.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that the firm lives within the matrix and it can only survive in the big firms. And I don't know about if you ever want to have some practical life issues businesses and ones that I've seen what happens under
Actually, that's probably at least over 12.
And I have another model, another concept. It's called the citizen entrepreneur. It's a new classification that I consider and that is an entrepreneur is an individual that's associated with the influence of
Hey, where's the link?
Yeah, so they're allowed to.
Can you do Where's the link?
I'll show you.
How do we bring it up?
Oh,
Oh, there we go. Okay, so try clicking it. Let's see what happens.
okay, cool.
Cool. Yeah, but is the audio coming up over the system?
Well, let's find out. I gotta take off, so thanks.
Oh,
Yeah,
you're
I
done
got it.
for.
Yeah, I'm done.
Oh,
It's good to see you.
okay,
Yeah, it's
cool.
nice to meet you.
Yeah, totally, man.
Yeah, no worries.
Guess we'll see you in November if we don't see you before, right? Because we're going to be running that again. Okay.
Play it?
You can control that volume right here. Is it doing anything? Yeah. Can
Cool.
hear it.
Yeah,
It's
that's
working.
loud enough. Yeah. Cool.
Beautiful.
I know.
Okay.
So let's unplug. Can I just have someone help me get that all set up before I start?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. No, here.
I happen to be fairly technologically illiterate.
Which is hilarious in this day and age.
I know.
But you know, I sort of see it that way. I think that, especially computers today, you know, like people just see them as.
Am I good to unplug?
No, I'm just going to copy this and paste it to the desktop. Okay. No, but I find kids today. It's things that computers are just like they're.
It's not unlocking.
What do you mean? What do you want to unlock?
The microphone cabinet.
Here, you got it. Now try it. Why do you need the microphone cabinet?
Because there's a pouch in there with batteries in it that the guy left.
Oh, I can go
Did
get
you
some
bring-
batteries.
Do you have batteries?
No, I can go buy some. Do we need them right now?
Well, this one's down to one.
Which one? That one?
Yeah,
I'm
the
gonna
stream.
I'll run over to the bookstore and get.
Still though, why won't this? Whatever. Dave, do you have a PowerPoint?
No, I'm not going to use that.
Okay, I'll turn it on.
hear it okay, Steve? Yeah.
Just keep it behind.
Oh, so I don't like breathe into it or
Well,
something?
just so it doesn't rustle against the lapel there.
Ah, okay.
Should be good.
All right. Do you want me not to use this at all? Doesn't really matter. Okay, can I have everybody take a seat and we'll get the second session started? So, between today and tomorrow, I'm going to give 2 lectures on banking, and I've really been doing some soul searching to try to figure out what's the best order to do this. So we've got the present banking system, and then we've got a much more ideal type system that also existed in the past. And normally you'd think, you go through theory and history chronologically, so you start with the past and you start with the ideal type, and then you go into the present. But I think I'm going to do things backwards just to be extra confusing. So I'll start with the messed up situation that we've got today and then be more optimistic. We'll end on an optimistic note tomorrow and talk about how it could be better. Let's see if that keeps everybody happy. So banking's a big issue. Banks are, I think they're the most misunderstood business in the economy. For sure in the financial system, they're the most misunderstood company. They seem to be incredibly large, they seem to be incredibly important, they seem to be the root of all evil, they seem to be causing all of these problems. And this is very strange because no other businesses, to group them all together, seem to be like this. I mean, car manufacturers are not uniformly large or systematically important or troublesome. Well, maybe that's not entirely true because a lot of car companies are all of those. But I mean, barbers aren't like this, and I don't know what else. All of these industries, banking is really unique in this regard. So I want to go over and show why it is that banking is so strange, why it's such an outlier. And to start with, fractional reserve banking, the modern banking system that we have, there's 2 types of products that they offer, and they intertwine them together. And these products, if they separated them and offered them individually, there'd be really no problem. But it's this very strange blended product that they create, which is problematic. So on the one hand, in banking, you have banking services which are credit-based or loans. So this would be you go into your bank when you need a mortgage, you borrow money, or you go to buy a loan and you need to come up with some money, so you go into your bank and you get a loan to pay for your car. And for most of us, for sure for consumers and also a lot of businesses, the bank is their first stop where they go to get credit or to get loans. And then on the other hand, we also go to our banks for depository services. So you get your paycheck, you deposit it in a bank, your bank keeps it for you, gives you a debit card, and you go to the ATM and withdraw cash whenever you want. So we've got these 2 very distinct products, deposits and loans, that banks both offer at the same time. And I want to go through, and I guess I'll use a little bit of accounting, just some simplistic T accounts to show you how banking, what it originally looked like and how it's evolved and what we have today, and how these 2 types of financial products interact with one another to create banking problems. So once upon a time you got paid, and let's say you got $100 a week or 100 gold pieces, and you got to figure out what you're going to do with these gold pieces. You're not going to spend them all right away. You need to hold on to a couple for when you do spend them. And you could put them under your mattress, or you could hide them in your house, or you could carry them around on your person. But these are not desirable options. It's not entirely safe. There must be something better than just walking around with a whole bunch of gold. So we got these depository institutions that emerged. Originally, they were goldsmiths. And goldsmiths were, they were goldsmiths, but they also started using, or offering rather, depository services for your gold coins. So you could go to these people, you'd give them your gold coins, they would keep them safe for you, and they'd give you some claim forms to them, like a paper slip that says you have 1 ounce of gold housed in this goldsmith. And you could go and use that claim form as if it was money, or as if it was gold in this example. And the goldsmith, to take an accounting approach to see what it actually looked like, has a balance sheet, or rather a T account with some assets and some liabilities. Liabilities, I think. And when you go into your bank, or when you went into this bank, you made a deposit with your gold. And that deposit, from your banker's point of view, or from that goldsmith's point of view, is a deposit. It's a liability because they owe you that money. You can go and ask for that money or that gold whenever you want. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you went in and you said, hey, I want to deposit $100 with you. Goldsmith takes it. And originally, they practiced what was called full reserve banking, or 100% reserve banking, which basically meant that they would take this $100, they'd put it in a vault, they'd keep it safe, and they wouldn't use any of it. So they would hold on to it in what we call a reserve. You could think of this as just putting your $100 in a safe. They're not using it at all, and you get a claim that says, at this bank, at this full reserve bank, you have $100. You can go and make claim on that at any time. Or you could go and buy something and give somebody the slip of paper that says you have $100 in this bank account, and then that person will have a claim to it. But the main point is that the bank does not make use of this money at all. And to keep the accountants happy, you can see that your assets equal your liabilities. So from an accounting point of view, everything's satisfied. Now, the banker is, over time, looking at this situation, and they've probably noticed something, and you might notice something as well, as to how often people are actually going in and asking to get their deposit back. From the banker's point of view, they probably notice that not everybody is coming in and asking for all their money back every single day, or there's always an amount of money which is going unused, or seemingly unused, I should say. And probably most of us can relate, because if you're like me, I have a bank account at a little credit union here, and I always keep like $1,000 and some dollars in it. And that $1,000, I never let my balance go below that, because then they start charging me fees. So from the bank's point of view, it's like I've got a $1,000 deposit that I really never make use of. Every now and again, I do make use when I have an emergency and I need cash in a hurry, but mostly it just goes unused. So from the banker's point of view, in this situation, they're looking at it and saying, oh, there's a deposit here, which I know I'm supposed to pay out whenever this depositor asks for it, but this depositor doesn't seem to be asking for it very often, or not everybody's coming in and asking for it at the same time, or the vast majority of the time, it's idle. It's being unused, at least from the bank's point of view. And I'm going to put some caveats onto this at the end. So what were these somewhat savvy bankers supposed to do? Well, historically, they looked at this and they said, well, let's start using some of these reserves. Since it's very rare that somebody comes in and asks for all of their money back, we can maybe put some of these reserves to good use. Maybe we'll invest them, we'll make a little bit of money off it, and everybody will be happy. We'll try to have it available for when people come in and ask for their cash. So we'll invest prudently, and we'll only let good borrowers actually make use of the money. And we'll get the best of both worlds. So we have the emergence of what you can really call fractional reserve banking. Fractional reserve, because now the bank will not keep 100% of the deposits in its reserve account. They're only going to keep a portion of it. So I want to take you through a couple iterations of how the fractional reserve banking system works. So now let's say we've got bank A. And it has its assets and its liabilities. And just like before, we go in and we deposit our $100 paycheck. And this bank has noticed that at any given time, I only come in and ask for $10 back. Like on any given day, I'm only asking for $10. So most of this deposit is just sitting in that account, not being used in any way whatsoever. So the bank decides that it's only going to keep on reserve that $10 that I come in and ask for periodically. And the other $90, the remainder, it's going to put to use in some way. And the way that banks put your deposits to use, anybody have an idea what they do with it? Yeah, they loan it out. Mortgages, consumer loans, car loans, lines of credit, things like this. Let's just say that they make a mortgage. So they sell a mortgage or issue a mortgage to somebody for the remaining $90. Your assets still equal your liabilities, so the accountants are happy. And now we've got a completely different ball game, which is seemingly positive in some ways and then seemingly negative in other ways. On the positive side, with this full reserve bank, when you walked into that, it was a costly service, right? If you go into any depository, like if you have, let's see, if you have a storage, what do they call those storage lockers? Where you go in? Safety deposit boxes, and when you have too much junk in your house, so you start renting a storage shed to put stuff in, and you have to pay for these depository services. Well, that's like this bank here. You walk in and you say, hey, can you hold on to this $100? Can you let me make a deposit? And they say, yeah, that's okay. And you say, well, what's it going to cost me? And they say, 2% of your deposit per year. So here we're going to pay $2 per year to have this service. And that's how the banker makes their money. But over here in the fractional reserve banking system, the bank no longer has to charge you fees for your services because they're going to be making money off these mortgages, right? Somebody's going to go in and borrow, and the bank's going to make a little bit of interest off this, so they're going to cover their expenses. And to try to get more customers, they might even offer you an interest rate on your deposit now. So, I mean, you sign up for a deposit account, and what do you get? 1/1,000,000% on your deposit. This is how it's paid out through interest that the bank earns on its investments, its mortgages. So from your point of view, you're probably pretty happy with this situation because it's much more cost effective. And from the bank's point of view, they're making money as well. So they're still whole. They have an alternative source of income that's not fee-based. And the only problem that arises is what happens if you go in and ask for more than $10? And in that scenario, the bank's got to come up with some money in a hurry, and we'll look at this later. They could borrow money from somebody else or maybe draw in some of these mortgages. But the fact of the matter is that banks have many, many customers, and the withdrawal requests by their clients are by and large not correlated very well. So some people come in on Mondays and ask for money, some people come in on Fridays, and some people are making deposits on Wednesdays, and other people make deposits over the weekend. So all of these withdrawal requests that the bank is holding its reserve for, a lot of them cancel out with one another, so that the bank doesn't actually have to hold on to that much money in order to service them all, most of the time. Now, fractional reserve banking, this situation doesn't really look all that extreme. Well, it probably is extreme, actually, if you think about it, because the bank's only holding on to $10 worth of liquid cash in order to satisfy a redemption request that could be $100 in total. But let's take it through a couple iterations, because this person here who received a mortgage for $90, they went out and they bought a house, and what do you think happened to the $90? Goes into a bank. So they bought a house off somebody. I'm going to buy Redmond's house. $90 will cover it. $90 will cover the front paving stone, I guess. And Redmond's going to take this $90 that I just paid for, and he's going to go to his bank. He banks at Bank B and deposit it in his bank. And Bank B has some assets and some liabilities as well. And now that deposit is going to create a new liability for Bank B in the amount of $90. But Bank B is now going to have to do something similar to what Bank A did. They look at this and they say, well, let's hold on to a little bit of it as reserve because Redmond's going to come in on any given day and ask for that $90 back. So let's hold on to 10% of it in our reserve account. We'll put $9 in the vault, which means that the remainder, the other $81, is freed up for us to issue or invest. So let's sell a mortgage to somebody worth $81. And again, our assets at $90 still equal our liabilities at $90, so the accountants are happy. And now we've got a money supply which has grown. Now, originally, there was only $100 in this banking system, right? I worked, I made $100 this week. I went and deposited in the bank. And in terms of currency, there's really only $100 in this banking system. But if you think about how much money people think are in this banking system, well, I've got a deposit worth $100. Redmond's got a deposit worth $90. So it's like there's $190 or 190 claims to dollars in this banking system versus the $100 worth of physical currency that's actually in it. And this process, we can go through a whole bunch of iterations. So I mean, this mortgage, this borrower right here goes and buys a house, and the person that they buy their house from goes to their bank, let's call it Bank C, and they deposit in $81, and their bank holds on to, let's say, 10% of it, so they have a reserve of $8.10, which means that they've got a mortgage freed up of $72.90, and again, our assets still equal our liabilities, now $81. And we could keep doing iterations. Now somebody's going to have to deposit that $72.90 into their bank, and that bank's going to hold on to only $7.29 and do a mortgage for the rest. And the math is getting complicated, so I'm going to end the example there. But you can see that we get a whole bunch of deposits which get ballooned off of the original deposit of cash that I put into the banking system. And if you were to work out, we've really got a series. If you were to work out all of these claims to money that people have, so I've got a $100 claim to money, Redmond's got his $90 claim to money or deposit, and this person's got an $81 claim to money. And if you just add all of those up, well, you're going to get a pretty big amount of, obviously you're going to get a pretty big number, but we can actually sum the series to show what it's going to look like. I'm going to introduce just a couple of concepts here first. One is what we call the reserve ratio. Let's call it RR to be creative. And the reserve ratio is the percentage of a deposit that the bank is going to hold liquid in that reserve account. So you could consider it probably as just currency sitting in a vault somewhere. The percent or the ratio of deposits held in reserve. In this example, it's 10%, right? Every single deposit, a bank held on to 10% in their liquid reserve account. And the second concept, which is related from this that we can talk about, is what we call the money multiplier. And the money multiplier is the number of times that an original deposit grows to define the total amount of bank deposits that are in the system, or the bank deposits are really claims to money. So in this system, we've got a money multiplier, which is the number of times an original deposit grows to become the total money supply. And in this example, the total money supply is going to be the sum of all the deposits. And we can also solve for that fairly easily. I won't work through the math, so you can just take my word for it. But the money multiplier is just the inverse of our reserve ratio, or 1 divided by your reserve ratio. So in this example, we've got 10%. So 1 over 10% is the same as 10. The money multiplier is the number of times that your original deposit is going to grow to create your total money supply. So if it's 10 in this example and we have an original deposit of $100, the sum of all of those deposits must be $1,000. 10, the money multiplier, times the original deposit. If you think about it then, we've got a banking system that only has $100 worth of actual money, or actual, let's use currency in this example. But people think that there's $1,000, or people actually do have $1,000 worth of claims to money. So we've all got our bank accounts, and there's very little money actually sitting in the bank account to satisfy all of these deposits that we have. Now, from the example, I'll just change it up a little bit. You can see that the money supply changes according to what that reserve ratio is. So 10% is actually pretty high. Does anybody have a more realistic guess at what the reserve ratio is in a country? 8%? Yeah, let's say 3% is probably, for reasonable countries, 3% is a pretty good guess. So here, our money multiplier now, if we're dealing with a reserve ratio of only 3%, the inverse of 3% is 33. So if we had I'm not going to do it, but if we went through this whole example and we showed all these banks, if they were only holding 3% reserve, so in this example you deposit 100, the bank could hold on to 3 and issue a mortgage for $97. If you added up all of those, you'd end up with 33 times the original deposit for the total money supply, which is $3,300. It gets more extreme the lower the reserve ratio is. Actually, in Canada, do you know what the reserve ratio is? No. There's no reserve ratio in this country. By law, banks don't have to actually keep anything in reserve. Now, most banks do. It would be silly from a bank's point of view to not keep anything, because if you're trying to attract banking clients, how are you going to do it? Well, one way would be to offer low-cost services. Of course, that's what a lot of people want. But people also want to go to an ATM and actually get money out of it, or go to their cash, to their bank and actually get cash when they ask for it. So from the bank's point of view, although they probably want an extremely low reserve ratio because that frees up a lot of money for them to loan out for mortgages and profit-making activities, they don't want to draw it down to 0 because that would defeat the whole purpose of attracting clients and keeping them happy and things like that. And despite what you might think, banks probably do care somewhere along the line about keeping clients happy and retaining them and things like that. So you could see if, given that Canada doesn't actually have a legislated reserve ratio, if the reserve ratio, as it falls down to 0, what does the money multiplier tend to? Infinite, right? So as banks keep drawing down the amount of reserves that they have, the money supply just grows unbounded up to infinity, assuming that they actually drew down their reserves to 0. In Canada right now, notwithstanding the fact that there is no legislated reserve ratio, banks are holding in the neighborhood of about 2% of reserves. That's a good ballpark to have. And that's about standard for most countries in the world. 2 to 3% is what most of the banking systems actually have in them. Now, people probably look at this example and say, well, the fractional reserve banking system is really great in a lot of ways, because look at how many investment opportunities we've created. There's a lot of money freed up, like there's $90 which was loaned to somebody, and there's $81 that somebody went and used a house to, boost up Toronto housing prices, and there's another $72.90 there worth of mortgages, and there's a lot of investment opportunities that it creates. But what's the difference in the total wealth of this banking system here versus this full reserve banking system? Any difference? None. Because over here, we've got a whole bunch of mortgages, we've got a whole bunch of debts which are offset by people's, well, from your depositor's point of view, this deposit is your asset. So we haven't actually created any wealth because we're always canceling out all of these things. Like here we've got an asset for a bank of $90, but it's also a liability over here for $90. All of these assets and liabilities cancel out with one another, and the total wealth of the fractional reserve banking system is no greater than it is in the full reserve banking system. It just superficially appears that way because they're intermediating a lot of loans and allowing people to borrow money and go in debt and do all sorts of potentially foolish things, I suppose. Maybe also good things, but probably a lot of foolish things. Now, banks in this fractional reserve banking system are, in many ways, the primary determinant of what the money supply is. Or they're the ones who really control the money supply. Because the total amount of money in this banking system is really driven by how many deposits exist at any one time. And the deposits are in turn driven by how many loans each one of these banks want to intermediate. And the loans themselves are determined by what the reserve ratio is, where are we, that banks actually want to hold on to. So it's these fractional reserve banks which are determining how much money supply is actually going to exist in the economy. And this is a very different understanding, I think, of the financial system than most people have. Because if you were to ask most people, or I'll just ask you, who do you think controls the money supply in Canada? The government. Most people would say the government, and if you want to be technically correct, you'd say, oh, the Bank of Canada. But the Bank of Canada really only controls one type of money, right? They've controlled maybe the amount of currency, the amount of deposits which are being put into this system, but it's the fractional reserve banking system which has really controlled all of the claims to this original money through their deposit accounts, through the reserve ratio that they want to maintain. In this example, I mean, you could hold the Bank of Canada culpable for creating, let's say, $100. That would be the actual currency that they've created. But remember, there's $1,000 worth of total deposits here. So if the Bank of Canada is responsible for 100 of those dollars, it must mean that this fractional reserve banking system is responsible for creating the other $900. So you see how I mean it's the banking system which is much more responsible for the money supply than the actual central bank. And remember, this example, these 3 iterations, they're assuming that the banking system holds a reserve of 10%. But in actual fact in Canada, it's under 3%, which means that, well, if you do the math, the banking system is really controlling and creating the vast majority of the money supply. Actually, just out of curiosity, when you put a deposit in your bank, who do you think owns it? Okay. Are you saying that because you think it would make me happy, or is that what you actually believed? Okay, good. That's the correct answer. When you deposit money into your bank, the bank owns it. And I think for most, I probably have an educated audience here, but most people this would strike them as completely crazy that you put money into a bank and it's your deposit and you're no longer the owner of it. And of course, banks become the owner, which is why they're allowed to do with it as they please, right? The bank decides how much they're going to keep on reserve. You're not the one who decides this. And they decide how much they're going to lend out, and you have next to no say. Well, actually, you have no say on how much or what type of investments or loans the bank actually does. And that stems from the bank being the proper owner of it, or at least under this system, they're the owner of it. Tyler?
Sorry, just a very point of clarification. So in the non-fractional reserve banking, do you still own it? Because that's kind of where there'd be a distinction, I guess, for me is when you, in exchange for the service of not charging for the service, you are contractually giving that ownership to the fractional system.
Yeah, that's a good question because we don't actually have any full reserve banking systems today. But we do have other depositories that you could use as counterexamples. So grain silos are depositories for farmers, or safety deposit boxes and things of that nature. And the depositor is the owner of those goods. Like if you go and you put a ring in a safety deposit box, the bank doesn't own that ring. In fact, they don't even get to look at that ring, right? They can't open that without you. So in other types of depositories, full reserve depositories, I guess we could call them, though not banks, the depositor does retain ownership. And it's only in this fractional reserve banking system where they sacrifice ownership, knowingly or not. And the vast majority of people, this group notwithstanding, doesn't think that they give up the ownership of their money. Now, the fractional reserve banks are the primary driver of the total money supply here. The central bank, you could say, is also a determinant of the money supply, but only a little bit, right? They've only controlled the actual amount of currency in the system. But there's another group that's also controlling how much money is in this system. Guesses? You got banks. It takes 3 to tango in this case. You got the central bank, which actually created the initial amount of money. You've got the fractional reserve banking that provided all of the deposits or created all the deposits. But then depositors also determine in some way the money supply. Because if you're a depositor and you go into your bank and you say, I don't know, let's say who's this? This is my bank. I go in and I ask for my $100 back. That means that the money supply is going to have to shrink, right? This bank is going to open up the vault and give me its $10. And then it's going to have to draw in some of these mortgages or come up with money somehow to come up with the other $90. And of course, if they draw in a mortgage for $90, that means that this bank is going to be affected because no longer will they have $90 deposited. And we get a whole daisy chain where all the other banks are going to be affected and they'll have to start drawing in their loans, drawing in their investments to come up with the cash to actually satisfy my redemption demand. So we've got depositors determining how much money is in the system, mainly by how much deposits they want to have versus currency. So you could take all your paycheck. You don't have to use banks. You could get paid, and you could just go into your grocery store. I don't know if they still do this and convert it into cash. Grocery stores still do this. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, and this was kind of people didn't even have banks. This was common. So you'd go in and you'd give the grocer your paycheck, and you'd validate it, and then they'd give you the cash equivalent, and you'd just walk out. People just held on to currency. So if you wanted to hold on to currency without using banks, this banking system wouldn't exist. And definitely, the more currency you hold on to and the less you make use of deposit accounts, the less money supply is going to result because banks will have to draw in their loans and this whole system's going to shrink. So there's really 3 groups that are determining the total money supply here. What's the economic problem? There's an obvious problem here if you think about it, because if the bank has originally done this under the pretense that as long as everybody doesn't come in at the same time and ask for all of their deposits back, they're going to be able to satisfy everybody. So as long as in this banking system, nobody comes in and asks for more than 10% of their deposit, no problem, right? The banks, each individually have exactly 10% of their deposits on reserve as liquid currency to actually satisfy redemption demands. So there's only a problem if everybody comes in and asks for more than 10% of their money back. Normally this doesn't happen, thankfully, from a bank's point of view. Can you think of a circumstance where all of a sudden a whole bunch of depositors would go in at the same time and ask for money? Greece, political instability, banking sector instability, in general, when people lose confidence in their banks, or maybe just when people start realizing, hey, I don't have very much money, this bank doesn't have very much money sitting in the vault to actually honor me, to honor my deposit. In fact, what happens if nobody knows that this is how the banking system works? And then all of a sudden one day, there's a news story on breakfast television, and people, they blow the whistle on the banking system, and now all of a sudden everybody looks at this and they say, holy smokes, my bank, you're telling me that my bank only has a couple of dollars sitting in reserve to honor my deposit. And all of a sudden, if everybody sees this at the same time, there's one of two things that you could expect to happen. The first is, well, everybody's going to go to their bank and they're going to ask for their money back. And from the bank's point of view, they're either going to give the full deposit back to, let's say in this example, the first 10% of people that show up. The whole banking system only has 10% of those deposits sitting in a reserve account. So either the first 10% of people that show up at the bank are going to get all of their deposit back, or the bank is going to say something like, sorry guys, but everybody's only going to get 10% of their deposit back. So I know you had $100 with us, but I'm only going to give you $10. Neither of these outcomes is desirable. And they both give rise to what we know as the bank run. Everybody's motivated to run to their bank as quickly as possible to try to be the first person there before there's a problem so that they have a fighting chance of getting all of their deposit or the most amount of their deposit back. So this is exactly in Greece why you see everybody waiting in line at their bank or trying to be there as quickly as possible. And in Greece, because it was like a slow-moving train wreck, really slow-moving, it was like 6 or 7 years here it's been going on. So you would expect that people had already removed their money from the banking system, and they didn't wait until the last minute. But that notwithstanding, everybody went to try to get this deposit at the same time, and of course banks don't have enough to actually make good on it. So what's a solution to this problem? They could go to the Bank of Canada and they could borrow. So maybe Stephen Poloz wants to issue loans to all these banks to try to tide them over. And actually, this is what we call a lender of last resort. This is one of the primary functions of the central bank. And note, I'm not endorsing this, and I'm going to give a counter viewpoint in my next lecture. But maybe the Bank of Canada could just step in and make some loans to these banks to keep them afloat. Or alternatively, you could issue IOUs, so they could either make loans or they could just actually print up money and give it to the banks, alternatively, or? They could borrow from each other. They could borrow from each other, except all of these banks are kind of in the same boat, so that's probably not an option if it's a general banking crisis. But yeah, that would be if any individual bank ran into difficulties. And most banks do this, actually, over the course of a week. About 50% of banks are going to be in difficulties. Difficulties from the point of view that let's say that there's actually a legislated reserve ratio where banks have to keep 10% of their deposits on reserve. And from the bank's point of view, this is a little bit difficult because over the course of the business day, people are coming in and making withdrawals and they're making deposits, and the bank is estimating how much they need to keep on hand, but they don't really know until the dust settles and business actually closes. So many banks at the end of the day actually find themselves a little bit short, and then they look to each other to actually borrow money to make up the shortfall. So that happens. Or?
You could rent a really, really, really big helicopter and you could tell the notes from the sky on all the citizens.
Paper bombs.
Who was the economist who recommended that Keynes or Bernanke?
Yeah, Bernanke, yeah. Yeah, or Milton Friedman originally, yeah. A helicopter drop. So we could do that to recapitalize banks. And you know what? These are all solutions, but they're all a little bit imperfect from the depositor's point of view because they let the problem happen. I mean, we've got a problem here where everybody wants their money and there's not enough, and then we're kind of ex post facto coming up with a solution. So the banking system and the central bank and the government, everybody together has come up with a solution to combat this problem ahead of time, and it's deposit insurance. So we've got CDIC here in Canada, where when you walk into your bank, it's a little bit less prevalent here than it is in the States, but every time you walk into your bank, there's a sticker on the door of the bank that says you're CDIC insured up to, what is it now in Canada? 60, okay. When I left, it was like 25 or 30 or something like that. So as long as you have a deposit below $60,000 in any individual account, or I think it's per bank maybe, if that bank goes bankrupt, Canadian Deposit Insurance Corporation is going to pay out. Now, this is a solution to the problem, because now nobody runs to their bank to withdraw their money. Nobody's worried anymore that the bank is going to have a deposit there for them when they ask for it, because even if the bank doesn't, the Deposit Insurance Corporation is going to make good on it. So nobody's scared anymore. We've eliminated the bank run.
Where do they get their money from?
Where do they get their money for? And except, what if you have more than that?
They're underfunded massively.
Well, yeah, and what happens when it actually gets tested? Because CDIC hasn't really ever been drastic. Well, the FDIC actually ran out of money. This is a good question. How do they get money? So I don't know if you guys know this or not. And because we don't pay, compared to the full reserve banking system, we don't pay that much in banking fees. But we do pay banking fees that fund deposit insurance. Mostly it's the result of banks making money off mortgages and then paying us a lower interest rate on our deposits than would otherwise be the case. So we fund our deposit insurance. It's not a free lunch by paying premiums into it. But what happens if there's not enough to actually pay out these accounts, like happened in the States, and Congress had to recapitalize it, so they used tax dollars to shore up the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to make up for the shortfall. But we've got an even bigger problem than this. Actually, we make this problem worse. Because now that everybody knows that their bank account is insured, what's everybody's attitude towards the banking system? Moral hazard. Everybody's really lackadaisical about this whole situation. So nobody's looking at their banks anymore and saying, oh, who's the prudent one and who's the safe one and anything like that. In fact, now that in this banking system, when you're checking out your banks, what do you think are the qualities that you're looking for in a bank? Security, availability, probably security, right? You want to make sure, you're paying for a service, so you want to make sure that that money's always there. In this banking system, what do you think are the qualities that you're looking for? Return on investment, low fees, things like, both of those are the two different sides of the same coin, because really, the return on investment is what you're making on your deposit, and the deposit has an interest rate paid according to what the bank earns on its investment portfolio. And if the bank wants to increase what it's offering you on your deposit account, it needs to take on riskier investments that are going to yield it a higher return. So it's going to issue riskier mortgages to less creditworthy individuals so it earns more interest. And that will allow it to attract more depositors by offering greater interest rates. And we get a big moral hazard problem. I'll tell you, not to date myself, but to age myself a little bit, but when I opened up my very first bank account, I was 15. And Canada's easy because there's only a handful of banks. And the internet existed, but PDFs didn't exist at this time. So I went into all the banks' websites and I wrote an email to corporate relations and I said, can you send me out a copy of your financial report? And I was that type of 15-year-old. And the girls loved me. And I got these 6 annual reports and I read them all and I was trying to figure out, well, who's the most financially stable bank? Because I don't want to put my $15 paycheck. This is back when minimum wage was, like $4 an hour or something. And I don't want to put my meagerly income into an unsafe bank. So I was trying to figure out what's the safest bank out there. And as I was comparing all of the annual reports, they were all basket cases. I looked at them and they had no cash. None of these banks actually had any cash, which I thought, as a 15-year-old, that's a little bit strange because you'd think banks would be full of cash. But the reason they don't have any cash is because they've only got these very small reserves. That's the actual cash in the banking system. And then I kept researching, and then I found out about Canadian Deposit Insurance Corporation. And when I found out about that, my attitude changed completely. I thought, well, first I threw out all the financial reports, the annual reports. I didn't need to know how safe any of them were anymore because no matter what happened, I knew that I was going to be backstopped. So I pursued the most risky bank possible, CIBC, because they were offering me the greatest interest rate on my deposits. And also there was a bank machine closest to me, which made it a little bit convenient. But those were really the criteria that I was looking at. They had nothing to do with how stable the bank was, how prudent its investment portfolio was, or anything like that. I just wanted the best, really the best deal, the best bang for my buck. Now, of course, if everybody behaves this way, and everybody does behave this way once they find out the problem, what happens to the stability of the banking system? It goes down. As soon as everybody realizes it doesn't matter what type of quality of mortgages the bank makes or how prudent their investments are, everybody goes for the least safe bank possible because that minimizes the cost of their deposit account or even increases the rate of return that they're going to earn on their deposits. So as a whole, you get a destabilized banking system because of deposit insurance, and deposit insurance is created to combat a destabilized banking system. So it's like this vicious circle, right, where you have something that's in place to solve a problem, but it actually makes the problem even worse. That's the moral hazard of the financial industry. Now I want to stop with, I've got a couple minutes left, but I just want to talk about 5 problems with banks. I started the lecture by saying, banks are a little bit strange because they're unique in several ways. I want to go over the three biggest problems of banks and explain why it is that fractional reserve banking system actually creates the problem. The first question you might ask yourself is, why are banks so big? Like in the economy, every country of the world, if you were to look at it and try to establish what the biggest companies are, they're all banks, every single country. America's obviously got the biggest one because it's the biggest country. Canadian banks are far bigger if you were to take them as a percentage of the economy or on a per-person basis or anything like that. Small European countries like Belgium, as a prime example, have absolutely massive banks relative to the size of the people, or Switzerland has massive banks. No other company is universally as large as banks, right? Car companies are pretty big. That's a bad example. Barbers. Why don't you see a hairstylist or a barber shop, which is massive? Or why don't you see grocery stores that are massive? Oil companies are quite big for different reasons, because they have high fixed costs and there's economies of scale and things like that. But why is it that banks are so large? Well, one reason banks are so large is because think about any company. As you're growing your business, what's one of the primary difficulties of growing your business? Getting customers, that's a pretty big one, and it takes money. You need money to make money. So to get customers, we need to come up with some money. So we've got to go out and borrow normally to try to make some investments. Well, for banks, when they make their investments, they've got the very cheapest borrowing possible. Everybody else, every other company, if you want to grow, you go to your bank and you borrow money, and they charge you an interest rate on your loan, or you go to the stock market and you issue shares and you have to pay a dividend, right? It's always costly. But banks, when they want to grow, they just try to attract more deposits. They pay us our little meagerly, 1/1,000,000th of 1% interest rate. And then it's effectively cost-free for them to start making their investments, to start issuing mortgages and loans. So think about if you were a business and you had an access to funding that was essentially costless. Of course you would be a massive company as a result. You'd have no downside to growing your business or investing.
Is it really costless if they do have to attract the customers and fight other banks to do so?
Yeah, it's not costless, but it's really low cost.
But if attracting customers is really tough, so it's not.
But all businesses face that problem of attracting customers, so that one's not unique to banking. And the banks actually get their funding source at low cost. Yeah, but that's a good point. The second unique feature about banks is, throughout this crisis, we kept hearing banks are too big to fail. Okay, we understand now why they're so big. But also people were saying, well, banks are so systematically important to the financial system and to the greater economy that if we let one fail, everybody else is going to fail as a result. And nobody said this about any other company, right? Nobody said, Barber Joe down the street, if he goes out of business, the whole company's going to fall down. Or Sally, the grocer over there, if her grocery store goes bankrupt, then the whole economy is going to collapse. But everybody said it about banks. So what is it about banks that makes them so systemically important?
Well, to some extent, they control the money supply.
They control the money supply, and that's what links everybody together, right? Everybody's related to a bank in some way. Not only is everybody related to the bank, so we've all got deposits, companies are all taking on loans, we're all taking on mortgages, things like that, but the banks are all related to each other. Like the success of Bank A is not independent of the success of Bank B, because if Bank B goes under, all of a sudden Bank A has got a big problem getting its $90 mortgage back because that was ultimately deposited over here. And Bank C is also related to these. So because of fractional reserve banking, all of these are dependent on one another. And if one goes under, then they've all got problems. Your barber down the street's success is not determined or is not related really to the success of the barber at the other end of the street. At least not in the sense that if that one goes out of business, it's going to hurt this one. If anything, it's going to make their business even better as they get all of those clients. The final point I want to address is the final downfall or negative aspect of this fractional reserve banking system is who determines what type of investments take place in the economy here? Bankers. The banking system itself is what's directing all the capital in the economy here. They're the ones who are determining what type of houses and who's able to buy houses. If you're a business and you're going to a bank, I just focused on the mortgage market, but businesses also go and borrow money from their banks. And you go and you see your banker and you say, hey, I need to borrow $100,000 to do this business. And they say, well, what's your idea? And you present it, and then the bank says, I don't know if it's a good idea or not, something like that. It's really ultimately the bank that's directing capital in the economy, which is drastically different than this system, because in this system, how would investments be made? By individuals. You'd sell shares on a stock market. Or, in that way, if you went and sold bonds, so you could issue bonds if you're a company, and then people would loan you money in that way, but they wouldn't necessarily be banks. Or you could go on the stock market, float yourself, and sell shares, in which case, again, individuals would be lending you their money, or investing in you, rather. But in both of those scenarios, it's not bankers anymore who are really directing capital. So here we've got an economy which has a banking system that is the primary determinant of what type of investments take place, an awful lot of housing investment, as the case may be, through mortgages, instead of letting venture capitalists or individuals direct investments, as would be the case in the full reserve banking system. And tomorrow, actually, I'm gonna address that. I've got a second part to this lecture where I'll look at the alternative to this situation, and we'll talk about implications for the economy. So I'll end it there before I go over time by too much. Thank you. And we'll take a 15-minute break, and then David Clement, if he's here, he's run away. He'll be back here to give a talk on knowledge and the economy. He's throwing up. Yeah. There we go. Yeah, thanks.
Would you describe the banking system as a fascist system, since it's collusion between government and banks? Well, but remember that.
Yep. Hello? Yeah, okay.
I'll just take a look if anybody's outside, David. I'll take a look.
Yeah, okay. Okay, all right, everyone, we'll get started in a few seconds here. So my name is David Clement, and I am the VP of Operations for Mises Canada. I'm also involved in a couple other libertarian organizations. So this is actually a presentation that I've wanted to give for a long time because it's about my favorite Austrian economist, von Hayek. Which according to some people makes me a rabid social justice warrior and a statist. But that's a different discussion. So the topic is the use of knowledge in society, and it's based off of Hayek's 1945 paper. And so Hayek posits the question, or the idea, he asks, what's the main problem that faces our economy? And he explains that the main problem that faces our economy is our ability to respond to change. In fact, all problems that we face economically are simply consequences of changes. I think that that's rather intuitive. It's fairly basic. I'd extend that and say that it's actually not just economics. It's not just an economic problem. This is something that is a fundamental aspect of human nature, with the key word being nature. So we see this problem in nature. For those who don't know, this is essentially all of life on Earth in one giant family tree that segregates out where everything has split off. That only exists, life as we know it only exists, as a result of an organism's ability to respond to change and adapt. But we also see it in our daily life or our daily commute. Anyone who drives in Toronto knows firsthand what it's like to deal with the headaches and the perils of trying to respond to the changes that the guy who was shaving while driving causes on the QEW. So, the question is, how do we plan to solve the issue of responding to changes? Now, a lot of people are probably going to cringe at the word plan, but it is important to state that all human action in some way or some shape or form is actually planned. The question is simply, who is planning for whom? So we have two very different types of plans. We have centrally planned responses to changing circumstances, and we have decentralized planning where individuals make decisions and plans for themselves. So Hayek points out that the issue with centrally planning decisions or responding to changes with central planning is that it requires total knowledge. So this is the idea of Hayek's knowledge problem. What he states is that in order to make that decision properly or adequately from a central position, the actor in question would have to know, would have to have total knowledge, which is something that's impossible and impractical. It's just simply not possible for a single actor to have all of the knowledge possible to appropriately make that decision. And that's the distinction he makes between centrally planned decision making and decentralized planning. And so the question is, which one is more efficient and why? So, yeah, we have Georgie Boy asking the same question. Why is decentralized planning more efficient? So the first reason why decentralized planning is more efficient is it allows for and capitalizes on the specialization of knowledge. So who here can tell me what the added additional value of a third bathroom in a 3-bedroom, 3-story walk-up at 52nd and 2nd in New York City would be? Probably no one. Who knows the answer to that question? Well, it's the buyers, sellers, and brokers locally in that market who negotiate, who discuss, and who respond to each other's wants and needs in order to find that answer. And so when we rely on central planning to make decisions like that, like the appropriate price or the additional value, what happens is we add in that significantly tedious task of trying to accumulate that knowledge, which is ever-changing, to a central body and then attempting to make a decision on it. I think if Hayek was around now and he saw YouTube and he was a fan of viral YouTube videos, he'd pretty much say that ain't nobody got time for that. I think that would be the appropriate response in regards to trying to accumulate all of this knowledge. But that actually isn't the the hinge pin that Hayek uses to explain, or the Austrian school uses to explain why decentralized planning is far more efficient. And the key reason on why decentralized planning is more efficient is that it allows for swift responses through the price mechanism. And the reason for this is that price acts as a coordinator for actions of different people in the same way that your own personal preferences guide your daily decisions. So what we have is we have price being used as a mechanism to overcome the knowledge problem simply because it's allowing us to act and make decisions without having full knowledge, without having the full knowledge of knowing all of the economic factors that go into the determination of value and things of that nature. So, why is price so important? And Hayek uses an example of tin. So he says if tin becomes scarce, those who work with it locally economize it. They use less of it and at higher prices. And what this does is it signals that shortage. We see a ripple effect through the economy where this price fluctuation affects the prices of other goods. And without ever knowing the reason for the shortage, we have consumers who are able to respond to what's going on. So let's say there's a tin shortage right now. Why is there a tin shortage? Has it become scarce locally? Is there a competitor product that's now replacing tin? Is J.J. Abrams making a new movie, making a spin-off of The Wizard of Oz, and he needs a bunch of tin for the new Tin Man? We don't really know. But the reality of this is that we don't necessarily need to know, so long as we can appropriately react to how prices work. And I have this symbol, which is pi, which I'm sure lots of people know the use of pi, but they might not necessarily know the history of pi, the reason why pi is what it is, the amount of decimals that we use for accuracy in regards to using pi, and things of those nature. But pi, and I'll do a side note here that I know I'm mixing objective and subjective knowledge, but I'm using pi as an example because it acts as something that allows us to do a variety of different things without actually knowing all of the internal workings and processes associated with figuring out what to do next or responding to changes. And so in some way, price operates much like a constant or mathematical constant in that it allows us to make those decisions. So what I will do here, which is just in case I absolutely butcher the lecture, is show a short video that explains in a more interactive and infographical manner what prices actually communicate to buyers and sellers in the market and why prices are important. Yeah.
What's better? Knowing the price of something or knowing with perfect information how much something should cost? It's a trick question. Suppose there are two farmers, Al Truis and Mo Cash. Each of them has 500 acres of land that could grow either corn or soybeans. Suppose I ask what their plans are. Both of them text back, I don't know. Now suppose we borrow a crystal ball from some genie, and we know everything. Among the things the crystal ball can tell us are that Brazil has had a terrible summer with drought and then late floods that wiped out 40% of their soybean crop. It also tells us that new uses for soybean curd have pushed up consumer demand for soy paste all over Asia. Meanwhile, corn crop yields have hit record highs all over the world, and at the same time, several countries ended their corn-based ethanol programs, leading to an extraordinary corn surplus. Our first farmer, Al, has to decide what to plant. Al never wanted anything for himself. All he cares about was doing what was best for all of humanity. He does research, trying to decide which crop will be better for humanity as a whole. But it's hard for Al to determine what information is most relevant, because he doesn't trust price information, and the knowledge that he needs is too dispersed, too specific, and too hard to learn. Now, Al knows a lot, but still not enough. He's stuck, and I don't know. So he makes a guess, plants corn. Al's put a tremendous amount of time and resources into his research instead of focusing on what he's good at, running a farm. As a result, he doesn't get much corn planted, has a hard time selling the corn he does produce. He has to sell for very little, and he ends up bankrupt. Let's look at Mo's experience. Since he cares only about profits, he focuses on prices. In early February, the price of corn futures falls sharply. But soy futures indicate that prices for soy delivered in August should be excellent. Why did this happen? Mo has no idea, and he couldn't possibly care less. Mo sells a large soy futures contract to lock in the high price and plant soy on every square inch of land that he owns. It's a selfish bet, one that'll make Mo a lot of money. Instead of trying to be an expert in all the disparate subjects he'd need to master, to have perfect information about the marketplace, he just focused time and resources on running his farm. And the only other information he used was prices. So he produced a lot of soybeans and did well for himself. Which of the two did the right thing, the better thing for society? What would the genie with the crystal ball have told us? The genie would have looked at the glut of corn and the shortage of soy that made it so valuable and told us what people need is more soy. But of course, there's no such thing as genies in the real world. Information is too dispersed, too complicated to solve the IDK problem through research. There's just too much to know. Fortunately, farmers don't need a crystal ball because prices do exactly what we were hoping that the genie would do. Farmers don't need to know why a price is high or low. In fact, no single person could possibly explain it fully. But by growing the crop that produces the greater profit, farmers can produce the crop that solves the shortage, meets the demand, and satisfies the requirements of innovation. It's impossible to attain perfect information about the entire marketplace, which is changing all the time. Prices are a way of condensing all that information into one easily understood signal. Almost like magic. Keep learning Liberty. Click on one of our other.
Okay, so that explains in a more flashy manner than myself how prices work. Now, it should be noted that when we're talking about prices, we do have to asterisk that with there are plenty of ways that government, without nationalizing or centrally planning things, distorts prices. So price is a signal, and the way Professor Munger was explaining it is obviously in an ideal world or in a system where prices are free. But even in regulated markets, we do still see price acting as this transfer of knowledge. And so where do we see these knowledge problems in real life? Well, the most telling example is the nationalization of food. And so you see images of Soviet bread lines, people literally lining up for hours just to get a loaf of bread because the Soviet Union thought it was a good idea to nationalize the production of food and do their best to allocate resources effectively. They essentially eliminated the price mechanism. Obviously, we know in the Ukraine, in the Soviet Union, in China with the Great Leap Forward, what happens there is you see mass famine, you see millions of people perish, all as a result of eliminating the price mechanism and failing to recognize that decentralized planning is far superior. We also see this in foreign aid. Foreign aid is essentially the nationalization of charity. So you have countries like Haiti, which are basically NGO hubs where everyone works in the NGO sector. You either work in the government or you work for an NGO. And there we have the same problem. We have government-run charity programs that are actually unable to respond to changes locally in Haitian villages appropriately. And what that does is it pumps a whole lot of money in without getting a lot done. And the third, which is more relevant, now these are not limited examples. Obviously, there's infinite examples of where knowledge problems are falsely attempted to be solved by centrally planning. My favorite one right now is Venezuela. I was the research assistant on a forthcoming book about how Venezuela's nationalization of land and food has caused extreme shortages, things like toilet paper, beer. Most recently, they ran out of cat food. We're seeing when government centrally plans an aspect of the economy, it almost immediately, like clockwork, falls apart. And so all of these disasters are perfect examples of how central planning and policymakers fail to embrace decentralization, and trying to centrally plan the economy ultimately turns to failure. Now, it should be noted that that book that is forthcoming is a non-Austrian's perspective on why nationalizing food or nationalizing land is ineffective. And so from a non-Austrian's perspective, it's always great to get academic work that supports what we argue for without necessarily being tied to the Austrian School of Economics or being a libertarian or things of that nature. So if you're interested in that at all, please let me know and I can talk to you about it and let you know where you can get it when it comes out and things like that. So, in closing, or in completing the idea of the knowledge problem in prices, I have in front of you a pencil. So a lot of the lectures so far today have referenced pencils as the example of how complex systems that are decentralized can come together to create wonderful things. And we don't necessarily appreciate a pencil, however, the process in which it comes together is pretty remarkable. And so, to close off, I want to show a very brief explanation of what actually goes into creating a pencil. Now, I do have to note that the commentator in the video actually gets it wrong in attributing the idea to Milton Friedman. It was actually originally written by Leonard Read, who is an Austrian economist. Milton Friedman is considered the person who popularized it. And depending on who you talk to here, Milton Friedman is either somewhat good or completely evil. So I will show this, and then I will close off, and we can go to questions about Hayek and the knowledge problem.
Look at this lead pencil. There's not a single person in the world who can make this pencil. Remarkable statement? No.
About 30 years ago, noted economist Milton Friedman released this extraordinary video, simply and elegantly illustrating the phenomenon of the free market. All he needed was a pencil. And on what would be Friedman's 99th birthday, we're taking another look at that simple tool. We live in a world of sophisticated products, from mobile phones and personal computers to microchips and high-def TVs. But what about the lowly pencil? Surely the pencil is not a miracle of the free market economy. Humble, unassuming, and seemingly simple, it is unlikely that a single person alive could make this pencil all by themselves. A ridiculous statement? Not in the least. What goes into a pencil? Well, let's start out with the cedar. The wood must withstand repeated sharpening without splintering. It can't warp or lose its shape. Probably comes from the northwestern United States. Consider the logging machinery, like saws, themselves produced by steel and other metals. Mined or developed domestically and overseas. Trucks assembled at factories in the United States or abroad, utilizing billions of dollars of factory equipment and professional know-how. Highly skilled loggers, themselves using countless products from clothes to coffee, which involve equally complex supply chains. Then take a look at graphite. Once it was mined from South America, and today it is more commonly produced at a factory to achieve the desired density. Graphite is typically mixed with clay for consistency and color. And then brass, which comes from copper and zinc, requires professional labor to extract its constituent metals from the earth. The brass creates a small device which, combined with tiny rings of black nickel, fix the eraser to the pencil. Then, of course, there's the eraser itself. It looks like rubber and is produced by mixing a particular seed oil from the Pacific with sulfur chloride. Rubber is then mixed with various accelerating agents like pumice from Europe to bind the eraser together. Then, of course, there's the wax, the lacquer, and the paint, all produced from a similarly complex network of raw materials, transportation, capital, and labor from all over the world. Millions of dollars of factory machinery managed by a professional labor force will then ensure that the pencil is cut, glued, and shaped, sanded, varnished, cleaned, and coated. I was able to buy the final product for only pennies. How? The batch chain of events, which itself would appear simple when compared to the process that produces a modern computer or cell phone, happens without any central planning. There is no congressional committee that determines the supply of rubber, metal, or lumber. No government official tells us how much it should cost or how it should be produced. It happens miraculously and seemingly invisibly because of the forces of the free market. We take it for granted, and we shouldn't. Because while it's easy to see the miracle of the natural environment, the miracle of the free market, even more astounding, is nonetheless invisible to us. Our founders fought the revolution to establish.
Yeah, it is an American video, so you can't really say the Canadian found. We didn't really fight for independence. We more asked for it. So that part of the video is not necessarily accurate. However, that video does highlight some key aspects of what Hayek was explaining or what Hayek was getting at when he described how decentralized planning can solve a lot of problems. We have something as simple as a pencil, which requires hundreds of thousands of individual plans that come together to make us something so simple and yet so complex, all without a central planner, all without someone behind the scenes saying we need this, we need X amount of this type of pencil in this place. Here we have individuals seeking out their decentralized plans on their own, which come together through spontaneous order to create something which is really quite amazing. And so, simply, decentralized planning and free markets make us free to do more with less, create better things, to serve more people and to serve the wants and needs of more people, and allow us to do things that would be otherwise imaginable, like making a pencil. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask how like the government kind of twists the price system to like subsidies, taxation in general.
Yeah, and I think that's the important point of my presentation, is that this is more an argument or an example of why centralization and nationalization are bad policies. It isn't necessarily an argument against regulation, although you could very easily extend this and argue that free prices allow for that knowledge to be communicated more effectively. And so the ways in which government distorts prices, like you said, are subsidies, price ceilings, price floors, things like minimum wage law. All of those government policies aren't the nationalization or centralization of any one process, but they affect the way that price communicates between us. And the more regulation we have, the more distortions we have, the harder it is to appropriately manage our decisions, because we're not reacting to proper prices. So if we go back to Munger's example of soy, which is a great example depending on the country you live in Canada, to my knowledge, the value of soy is almost completely subsidized. And so that is a distortion in and of itself. So it would just be moving from the knowledge problem to talking about price and why free prices are more effective. Yep.
I just want to share an experience I've had. I've been recruiting to assemble a team of experts in PLM technology in France, in Montbéliard, is the name of the city. And as I've been recruiting and talking to consultants in different parts of Europe, I've come across a lot of people who are French citizens, but they've left France. They've moved to Belgium and they've moved to Switzerland. The reason why they've done it, one guy in particular said to me, he said, Gene, he said, the politics and taxation of the government here is such that you really can't build a career and really rely upon tax structures so you can actually raise a family and have a mortgage and all that other good stuff. He says, I got out of France, I will not go back to France and work there, but I'm not going to live there anymore. So they're losing human capital over there because their policies are distorting the access of the labor pool, highly skilled labor pool.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Estonia's e-residency program? So what Estonia has basically done to be competitive and to pull resource, capital, and labor into the country is they've offered people e-residency, which gives you the power to run your business through Estonia and pay their significantly lower taxes. And so you see almost jurisdictional competition as you would see in the marketplace with different firms. So the country of Estonia is reacting to that signal and saying, well, we can do it better. We can have a flat tax that's significantly lower and not tax savings accounts and all sorts of other significantly more Austrian or more libertarian, if you want to say, policies. And so yeah, Europe is a great example because we're seeing that competition. We see it inside Switzerland with the different, they're not called provinces, but the way that they, cantons, the way that they compete against each other in regards to tax rates.
That's also been highly relevant in the manufacturing sector in Ontario over the last 20 years. So I've seen a number of manufacturing firms who have left Ontario because of energy policies, labor policies, a number of things. So we're scaring jobs out of the country.
And that actually lends to the first question, which is how is government distorting prices? The Ontario government, things like the Green Energy Act or a variety of other policies, is significantly distorting energy prices, which is changing the way that firms do business here or don't do business here. Yep.
Can you maybe comment
I would say that that at first glance, that would appear to be an accurate assumption, but I don't necessarily see that being the case. Professor Fox talked about this in regards to Charles Koch's book. That approach to business management is significantly more decentralized, and I would argue that it's a successful one. I can't speak to the internal processes of things like IBM or Microsoft or Apple and how decentralized they are, but I would assume that there has to be some reliance on local knowledge in order for companies like that to actually continue to grow. Obviously, innovation is the key factor, but if you had Steve Jobs or whoever is the head of all of these major corporations being the mastermind behind every plan, they themselves wouldn't have the knowledge to be like, okay, there's going to be this metal shortage in this province in China, and now we have to factor in that it's been a bad year in this production in another market we do business in. They largely rely on people to gather that information and consolidate it. So they are more decentralized than we think. But like I said, I can't speak specifically to each individual company or corporations at large outside of Mr. Koch's book. Yep.
In like political science classes, especially in the States, we have a lot of, they try to treat the political system, especially democracies as a sort of information transfer, kind of like a market.
Mm-hmm.
And the Austrian school clearly has reason to believe that markets are more efficient at communicating knowledge. But would there be more efficient forms of government than, say, democracy or representative democracy for the purpose of information transfer?
More efficient? Probably not. There are some who would argue that. I wouldn't. That's less on an economic standpoint and more on a moral standpoint, because I would argue that although they're not necessarily good signals of voting or civil activism, they are signals. And so I'd much rather have a democracy where you have that option or that signal as opposed to a monarchy or a theocracy or some form of dictatorship. Yeah, so I would say that it's obviously not ideal, but it's certainly the best that we have. Yep.
Earlier you commented on the subsidization of soy.
Yep.
Now, would you consider heavily subsidized soy to be considered a form of welfare?
Well, yeah, I think that it's largely made in the efforts to protect an industry or benefit farmers while collectivizing the cost of it. Would I call it a source of welfare? I think it's certainly a transfer of wealth because subsidies only happen by taxing people. I'm not necessarily sure it qualifies as like individual welfare, but you could certainly throw it in the category of corporate welfare because farmers are business owners. So subsidies to farmers for soy or any other agricultural product is not that different than a subsidy to GM or to Microsoft or any other company that receives a government loan or bailout or price protection or things like that.
Well, I wasn't referring to the individual farmer itself, but I mean, when you track back in terms of soy and you look at the patenting of GMOs and who owns the soy, and it all trails back to one company that we've discovered recently has an exemption, having their goods removed from the market in the event that it should be discovered at some point in time that their product is harmful to human life. So this company, for some reason, seems to be in a position higher than the government.
Sure. Yeah, well, so
They subsidize
yeah.
crop that can only be acquired through them. So is that, I guess I'm thinking in terms of a form of welfare for the very rich.
Yep. A lot of these subsidies, like the bailout to GM, is a subsidy to the rich because that money doesn't funnel through to middle-class Canadians or Americans, for that matter. It's a direct transfer of wealth from taxpayers to a business, to a corporation. So it is welfare for the rich. In regards to your question on agricultural products, I think that highlights the issues in regards to patent law and how you can patent things that naturally reproduce in the environment. I think that's an issue with patents. A lot of Austrians would argue against patents almost entirely. I think that's a that's a good question. If some individual were to have an antibody for a disease in their blood and a scientist were to discover it, could you patent the reproduction of that genetic makeup?
Yeah, Fred, how do you can?
That's a good point. I think the issue there in regards to GMOs is more about patents and patent law and how it's applied and how illogical or immoral it is, as opposed to the nature of GMOs.
Well, at the same time, one you could also argue as well that, in a sense, they do have, they can say that they create life, because that same company that has the patents on those GMOs has been discovered to have been a recent purchaser of a private army that lends troops to countries around the world.
Sure. You know what we should do is we should come talk to me about patents and other things of that nature after. We'll move on because I just see a couple other questions and I want to make sure we get to everyone. Yep.
Do you agree that the distortion of interest rates are the most significant when it comes to information distortion and credit?
Is it the most significant?
In regards to economic consequences.
My gut instinct is yes. Like distortion of money is the most significant. In regards to a deeper answer to that question, I'd have to sit on it and think and compare it to everything else. But my gut instinct is, yeah, the distortion of money and that way in which we communicate value, which is money, is certainly probably the most fundamental distortion of the market, or the distortion of price. Off the top of my head, I couldn't think of one that would have more significant impact. But then again, that depends on who you are and what your businesses are and things like that. Yeah.
Just tying into the earlier comment about the Estonian e-residency, what role do you see technology playing in shifting this balance from the government to the individual, the decentralization of that power?
Yeah. So the question is, how does advances in technology play a role into the transfer of knowledge? I think it actually does a great job of overcoming some of those government barriers that traditionally exist. And that is on the collectivization side, so going around things that are nationalized, but it also is on the prohibitive side. You look at something like the Silk Road, which existed entirely to work outside of the government's prohibition of illicit substances. So I think it plays a huge role in allowing people to actually communicate the real value of products. I use the Silk Road because it's a particularly innovative one, where it'd be very difficult, or the price of something like cannabis is entirely distorted by it being prohibited. And then you have people on the Silk Road using Bitcoin and using Tor to sidestep government regulation and actually have that conversation peacefully. So what would have otherwise been possibly a violent conversation that involves protection and guns and threats and broken kneecaps and the mafia is now two people at two different computers saying, hey, this is what I have, that's what I want, we both agree on a price, let's do this. And so, yeah, I think IT, or like advances in technology, are certainly going to enhance our ability to communicate knowledge, especially knowledge through prices. Yep.
So what do you think of the process then that the individual is empowered and allowed to step away from the overlord role of government by virtue of things like Bitcoin, transfer money internationally, residences in Estonia, etc.?
Sorry, what's the...
Where do you think that's going?
I think it's just going to continue to progress forward in a way in which it will make government obsolete. Not entirely, but government control over things obsolete. Look at Uber and the taxi cartel. As much as the taxis here in Toronto hate Uber, I get death threats when I tweet about Uber from taxi companies in Toronto. Pictures of car accidents saying this is going to be your Uber tonight, things like that. So as much as they want to scare and fearmonger consumers out of the market, they're really just the milkman or the typewriter mechanic trying to white knuckle their way into the future. And it's just a matter of time before they go away. And new technology like Airbnb, if we look at the largest hotel company in the world doesn't own a single hotel, Airbnb. The largest taxi company in the world doesn't own a single taxi, Uber. We're seeing technology significantly change the market at the benefit of consumers. It's the only reason why they're successful. And I think we're going to continue to see that. And these old, outdated models are just going to go away. They're going to go away rather aggressively, but they're going to go away.
So then Bitcoin, the future of Bitcoin, where it was actually pressured out of the banking system,
Mm-hmm.
Now it's trying to struggle to find ways to generate itself. I mean, in terms of international banking.
For me, Bitcoin isn't necessarily that Bitcoin itself will be successful, but more the idea of Bitcoin forward is where our society is going. I'm less interested in whether or not Bitcoin succeeds. I'm more interested to see where that technology continues to go and offer people outlets in which they are getting away from fiat currency and things like that. Yep.
You talked about Uber and frankly, on a personal basis, I love these kind of services. I love how technology democratizes all these kind of things. And, but the thing is, I see a conflict between, well, you have Uber and you have this cartel or monopolistic, somewhat monopolistic or oligopolistic system of taxi services that are already existing. But then that's still a manifestation of free market price signals and the development of this industry is still a result of free market economies, and they're conflicting with another, free market development, Uber. So how do you see this conflict playing out?
So the false assumption, and this isn't a fault of your own, the false assumption there is that the taxi industry has emerged as a result of being innovative and providing consumers with value, when in reality the taxi cartel only exists because they're a cartel, because the city levies a huge tax. I have no idea, I think it's over $100,000 here in Toronto on that taxi medallion or that license. So it isn't, it's a government protected monopoly going against a truly innovative product, as opposed to two firms competing in a free market. It's the emergence of a product that is operating outside, for the most part, of the realms of government regulation on who can drive a taxi versus their protected monopoly. So it isn't free market product versus free market product. It's free-ish market product responding to lousy government protected market. Yep.
Well, I guess a follow-up to that would be, well, sure, maybe a taxi company was a free market company somewhere at some point, right?
Yep.
So at some point, they believed that it was worthwhile seeking behavior, right, with the government, and established that kind of cartel.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see, going forward, how do you see changing the structure from the government's perspective so that we're not supporting rent-seeking behavior, right? Because then you won't have a constant system where you have, maybe Uber will become so dominant that they engage in rent-seeking behavior, right, and so on.
Yeah, like if Uber were to lobby for legislation that legislated them to be the only ride-sharing program, that would be an example of what you're talking about. How do we overcome that? Public choice economics would say that we can't, but I would be optimistic in saying so long as there are profits to be made, there's someone willing to innovate to get around whatever exists. So if a company like Uber were to try to seek favoritism, there'd be someone waiting in the wings to create a competitor, an alternative, and to push that limit in the same way that alternatives to the Silk Road have already come up, which are bigger than what the U.S. government shut down. So I think our reliance should be on continuing to promote innovation in the marketplace as a response to rent seeking, because to some extent, there's a counselor in Scarborough, I can't pronounce his last name, but he took just under $10,000 worth of donations from the taxi cartel and then issued a press release to Pan Am tourists saying, don't get in an Uber, it's against the law, you could get a $20,000 fine. Completely untrue, but there you have that rent-seeking behavior. That's going to happen. It's unfortunate, and those people deserve to be shamed and called out and ridiculed and all sorts of other non-coercive forms of debate or discussion. Those things are going to happen, but I'm fairly confident that as long as we allow people to innovate, they're going to continue to push the limit and get past those things.
Actually, I'm just going to cut it off there so we have lots of time for lunch. So.
Yep, that's fine. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to come down and ask.